Pretending to be a tough guy is a good way to get the better of people in a lot of situations. But when you actually come up against someone who isn't faking, you'd better have something to fall back on. Because if you don't, you'll end up looking like these guys right here. Here's what happens when acting hard goes very, very wrong. To kick things off, we have a fighter who learned a very important lesson about underestimating your opponent. Thankfully, it happened in the gym and not in the ring itself. But this young guy seemed pretty confident about his chances of beating up the older, former pro boxer. And as soon as their sparring match began, he pretty much set the pace, letting the old dude know that they were going to be sparring hard. And look, this younger guy wasn't a total beginner. He clearly knew what he was doing, to at least some extent. But when the old guy started really sitting down on his punches, the difference in skill became very, very clear. And it wasn't just technique either. No, this old guy seemed to have more power, more speed, and surprisingly more gas in the tank than his younger opponent. Judging by this short session, if they were actually fighting for real, the old guy would have made mincemeat out of the younger guy in about a round or two. By the time they stopped sparring, the difference in their energy was clear. The young guy didn't have any more smoke, and the old guy, well, the old guy looked like he could have gone 12 rounds right then and there. The lesson? Don't judge a book by its cover, folks. And always remember to respect your elders, especially if they're a former pro boxer. Whether you love him or hate him, with Joe Rogan, there's one thing that's absolutely undeniable. He's a legit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and if you're dumb enough to provoke him into using his skills, don't be surprised if he does it. And for this imbecile, he decided to debate Rogan on topics of immigration as they were standing outside a bar. Now, who knows why the camera was rolling, but this idiot kept turning up the heat on Joe, convinced that he was right. Rogan, being Rogan, met his energy on every turn, and the pair ended up getting kinda heavy in their argument. When the guy made the mistake of touching Joe, the former Fear Factor host made it clear that if he touched him again, he'd choke him out. And for some reason, this total douchebag decided to take him up on it. Next thing we knew, Joe had hopped directly into a guillotine choke. Thankfully, he did let go before he was fully locked in. And from there, the situation looked like it was calming down. But then this dude revealed that he found the whole thing exciting, as in almost being choked out to the point of unconsciousness by a celebrity. Yet this was the type of guy you should generally just turn and walk away from. Not even a tough guy, but undeniably a weirdo. All martial arts have some degree of benefit to them. In other words, if you're doing something physical, it's going to be healthy, at least to some extent. But if you're talking about using some of these fighting systems against an actual trained opponent, well, that's not healthy. That's where people get hurt. And for this so-called Bushido master, his attempts at legitimizing his martial arts skill by taking on an amateur boxer were just as bad as you might think. Bushido isn't the worst martial art in the world, but it's also next to useless against someone who knows what they're doing. And from the get-go, this guy's limitations were painfully obvious. He had no footwork, no head movement, no reasonable defensive skills, and he just couldn't mount any offense of his own. And when he finally got cornered by the boxer, he had no answer when the punches started flying. This is what total fighting incompetence looks like. He's lucky this wasn't a sanctioned bout, because if he stepped in there with a far less merciful opponent, there's a good chance he'd be leaving that ring on a stretcher. Bushido's all good and well for certain people, but don't bring it into a boxing gym like this guy. That fight only ever goes one way. Some reporters are just way too confident for their own good. And for this guy, interrupting his own interview to challenge the great heavyweight Alistair Overeem to a grappling match? Yeah, that's not the decision of a bright man. Well, anyway, for some reason, this kind of out-of-shape reporter seemed to think that he could stand up to this 260-pound monster. Funny enough, the Reem decided to take the reporter up on his offer. And before anyone knew what was happening, these two guys were going at it. But while the reporter was very clearly giving it 100%, Overeem was barely in first gear. And he made sure to add in a few playful punches just to illustrate the clear difference between the two. Maybe the reporter just wanted to see what it felt like to be totally dismantled by a world-class athlete. when they're barely trying. But it was clear that he was going for the win initially. Thankfully, Overeem made his point very quickly and painlessly. And overall, this reporter got off with maybe a few bruises and a hit to his ego. But let's be real. There are only a handful of guys on this planet who could beat Alistair Overeem in a fight. A good sparring partner will allow you to set the pace of the spar. In other words, you're going to get hit as hard as you hit them. And well, when you make the mistake of going wild on a Muay Thai fighter, don't be surprised if they put you in a world of hurt for your trouble. For some reason, this dim-witted wannabe decided to open up with wild punches on this Muay Thai guy. And as soon as he did that, he basically gave the guy full license to hit him as hard as he wanted. Punishment from a Muay Thai fighter is often a lot worse than most fighters too, as they favor a multi-tiered attack. Sure enough, kicks, knees, and punches would quickly follow. And before he knew what was up, this dude was in the middle of a thunderstorm of punishment, struggling to figure out where the next attack was coming from. Eventually, the barrage became far too much for him to deal with, and the contest was settled. But man, this is basically a public service announcement against hard sparring a guy that you're absolutely no match for. Carlos Condit is a former UFC interim welterweight champion, a two-time title challenger, and an all-round badass of the octagon. He's known for his highly dynamic and creative approach to the striking arts, and with a nickname like the Natural Born Killer, you just know that he's packing some real power. So when he attempted a military camp and offered to spar some of the guys there, he made the very fair proposal that he would only hit his opponent as hard as they hit him. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, some total idiot decided to take a major gamble with his health instead of being smart, going fully in on Condit with full power shots right from the get-go. Condit, being a man of his word, did exactly what he said he was going to do and proceeded to turn up the heat. And when he eventually found his opening, you'd best believe that he took it, knocking the dude out with a straight punch that was as good as anything on his highlight reel. What can we really say about this situation other than it's Carlos Condit? What did he expect? That's a world-class fighter right there. And you thought that you had something for him that guys like Nick Diaz, Rory McDonald, and GSP didn't? That takes an almost impressive level of ego. Speaking of ill-advised moves against UFC fighters, how about this sparring session between middleweight contender Uriah Hall and some random guy? Well, things looked playful and pretty straightforward at first, as Hall peppered his target with light shots, unwilling to put too much power in his attack. But when his sparring partner tried to nail him with a sneaky head kick that partially landed, it became clear that this session was about to take on an entirely different meaning. From there, Hall upped his tempo and began looking for the kill shot. And if you know anything about his kickboxing skills, you'll know that Uriah is an absolutely lethal finisher when he's in the zone. Unfortunately for this guy, Hall was totally locked in immediately after this head kick. And as soon as he found his gap, he turned into a spinning back kick to the midsection that landed cleanly, dropping his target immediately and causing this unfortunate fighter to curl up in pain. The lesson? Maybe save your head kicks for an actual fight. All this dude got was a hard kick to the body and absolutely no money to show for it. Just a viral clip that makes him look like a total douchebag. Uriah Hall might not have always had it his own way inside the UFC octagon, but he's still an absolute assassin who managed to stay in the top 15 or 20 at middleweight for close to a decade. Why do regular people think that they can hang with someone like Joe Rogan? The dude is a black belt in BJJ, under both Eddie Bravo and Jean-Jacques Machado, a former state kickboxing champion and the proud owner of a spinning back kick that the great Georges St. Pierre called the most powerful that he'd ever seen. And yet on this episode of Fear Factor, this wannabe tough guy ended up getting totally embarrassed by Rogan. So what happened? Well, this dude's girlfriend wasn't happy with how some of her fellow contestants were heckling her while she completed her trial. And so she walked right up to them and assaulted them on live TV. Sure, it wasn't the most devastating assault you'll ever see, but it was a physical assault nonetheless. When Rogan interjected and basically told her she can't go around hitting people, her fake macho boyfriend decided to get all up in Joe's face. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is never going to end well. Instead of beating him up on live TV, which would have been so easy for him to do, Rogan instead big brothered him completely by putting him in a Thai clinch totally nullifying any threat that might come back at him. Basically, he showed him who the boss was. Who knows if this idiot ever learned his lesson, but that's one embarrassing clip to have of yourself on the internet. Of that, there is no doubt. There are levels to boxing skill, right? Seems like an obvious thing to say, but to a guy like this, he only appeared to understand this when it was too late. We could make an entire series of videos chronicling what happens when some idiot decides to go gunning for a head coach at a boxing gym, but for our money, this is one of the best examples of why that is never a good idea. At first, it did look like this guy was circling well. However, as soon as the coach started landing, it became very clear that this dude had absolutely no idea how to box correctly. Every wild swinging punch was met with an immediate counter, and with every land, the coach seemed to be growing in confidence. Before long, this total novice was left swinging at air as the coach stood there hands down, beckoning him on. Who knows what this guy actually thought would happen, but it became very clear that his boxing fundamentals were basically non-existent. Thankfully, we live in a time where moments like this can be recorded and uploaded to the internet, something that stands as a warning to any other egomaniacs who think they can just walk in the door of a gym and rule it like a king immediately. This clip is a personal favorite, I'm not gonna lie. There's nothing quite like watching a street fighter learn about true martial arts the hard way. And after this dude spent a lot of time and energy calling out the actual fighter Lorenzo Trevino, he was invited into this gym to settle things the old-fashioned way. This guy claimed to be a high-level street fighter who didn't think much of MMA as a whole. And, well, if that's what he thought, man, did he learn his lesson here. Not only did his technique truly suck, but his ability to defend shots or adequately move his feet and his head were absolutely terrible. And Trevino, who probably felt obliged to teach this guy a lesson, didn't let his foot off the gas until this guy was knocked down to the canvas. This beating had it all. Trevino went up top, he went to the body, he taunted him, and he basically prolonged the beatdown up until he felt that the time was right to sit him down. And when that fight-ending blow came, the overhand punch, it was clear that this dude was toast. YouTubers are generally good at a lot of things: public speaking, marketing, video editing, and all with a healthy dose of charisma. But fighting is certainly a skill that most of them are sorely lacking in. So when the famous YouTubers the Janoskians decided to try to take on the Octagon legend and former UFC bantamweight champion Miesha Tate, they received a lesson in combat that they'll never forget. And look, it's not like these guys went in there brimming with confidence. But looking at Tate, who probably walks around at maybe 145 pounds, you'd be hard-pressed to be too scared right off the bat. But once Miesha started showing off her skills, it became very, very clear that she could fold all four of these dudes up like deck chairs if she wanted. Rear naked chokes, guillotines, bulldog chokes. Tate was tapping these dudes with whatever she wanted. And by the end, these YouTubers knew that they were totally out of their depth. Can you blame them, given that they clearly had zero training? Well, at the very least, they deserve at least a little bit of respect for actually stepping in there and trying their hand at some MMA. They're likely just delighted that they got someone as reasonable as Miesha Tate to go up against. Just because you're packing some muscles doesn't mean you're able to fight. Sure, you might be able to throw a few punches in a row, anyone can hit a heavy bag in a shed, but in a drawn-out fight, your limitations would become very, very clear. And for this strongman, he looked pretty decent in there with an actual boxer early on. His punches were thrown with okay technique. But the clear problems started when it came to his ability to deal with punishment coming back. Because for as much as this guy was able to be the hammer, he had no idea how to be the nail. And once the actual boxer got his timing down, the counter shots started landing. And at that point, it became very apparent he had no defense. That's always going to be a problem in there with someone who can crack like this boxer. As soon as he found his opening, the fight-ending punch was a vicious one. It didn't just stagger him either. No, this KO blow put this muscle-bound would-be fighter down face first on the canvas. No controversy here, just a clear display of how boxing training can help you when it comes to, not getting knocked out cold. Clean work. Sometimes the difference between a humbling experience in the ring and an actual major health event is a very merciful and level-headed pro. And for this journalist, who tried to take pro fighter Jason Ellis's head off, He's just lucky that he didn't end up in there with someone with less goodwill in their heart. The guy was very clearly untrained, or at the very least inexperienced when it came to using his hands. But he still tried his utmost to KO Ellis in there, swinging wild hooks at the fighter's head. Ellis, who was clearly miles ahead of him, was not intimidated in the slightest, and very calmly swatted away his punches, and even dodged some of them with his hands down. And instead of just KOing him stiff, he opted instead for body shots, landing repeatedly to the midsection and saved this dude from a certain concussion. Because if he actually wanted to, he could have made this a very quick and painful lesson for the journo. In the end, he hammered away at the midsection instead, and eventually, the journalist couldn't take any more, bowing out of this short but one-sided sparring match.